Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania here in what seems like perpetually foggy Philadelphia. Anyways, so today I want to talk about an article that was published in Scientific American by Lydia Denworth about politics and biology. But before we get into it, I hope you all had like a lovely COVID-19 version of Halloween. We just sort of hung out and ate some homemade cookies. My daughter isn't really old enough to be turbo disappointed yet that she didn't get to go out and everything. We went for a short walk, but we didn't really participate very much. She's, again, only about a year and a half old. But my heart goes out to all the parents out there whose kids did lose their mind. So, anyways, in case you're unaware, something sort of important is happening on Tuesday in the United States, the day after tomorrow. Obviously, I don't even need to mention it. I feel like I'd be totally remiss if we didn't acknowledge that it's going to be National Sandwich Day. So, everybody make sure you celebrate with your favorite sandwich and pay your respects to the most important food group, sandwiches. But there's also going to be a fairly gargantuan election going on here in the United States. So, be sure to join in and vote if you haven't already. And, just be sure to wear a mask, face covering of some sort that covers both your mouth and your nose. Whenever I go out, I also bring my own, travel size bottle of hand sanitizer, which can be pretty handy, particularly when I go into the office. So, given that Tuesday is National Sandwich Day, and we'd have a national election at the same point or at the same time, evidently, I figured I'd discuss this article that I saw in Scientific American about where there are neural correlates of conservatism and liberalism, or what would probably be called right and left politics outside of the United States. And again, this was written by somebody named Lydia Denworth, a science writer. So before I get into this particular article that Denworth wrote, I should also acknowledge that I recorded a podcast episode about some of the research that goes into just how much of our politics are inherited from our parents, right? Both via nature and nurture. It's an episode called Inheriting Politics, and I'll include a link to the podcast in the description below, because we do discuss quite a few studies that explore this topic. So I also have another podcast episode that explores the relationship between neurobiology and political behavior. Not the topic of heritability, but it's called What's in a Face. And so it talks about more than just politics, to be clear, everything from performance in business to pareidolia, which is the name of our tendency to see human-like faces in inanimate objects, which you can see some examples down there. It's always pretty fun. But we also get into how face perception seems to predict for political party affiliation and an ability to predict election victories. So it's not a super strong body of research, to be clear, but it's pretty fun and interesting. So if you're interested in those topics, check out the podcast episodes in the description below. Okay, so back to Lydia Denworth's article in Scientific American, which was published just a few days ago, actually. And so in general, this is a very condensed version of the relationship or of the research that explores this question of the relationship between or the relationship that nature and nurture, our biology in general, plays in sculpting political behavior. And so definitely not a criticism of this article. She didn't set out to review all of the research or anything like that. I just want to acknowledge that there's a bunch more research that's relevant to this conversation that she doesn't highlight, and I'm going to touch on some of them in just a little bit. So she opens up with a debate between William F. Buckley, a person who some would credit as being one of the first prominent leaders of the conservative movement in the United States. And so for folks outside of the United States, generally speaking, people who identify as conservative would fall along the right side of the political spectrum. So I only bring this up because a lot of other countries literally have parties called the Conservative Party and so on, or the Liberal Party, Liberal Democrats, things like that. It can get a little confusing, and the politics of American conservatives don't necessarily map onto those other countries' parties congruently. But anyway, she opens up by describing a debate between William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal. So Gore Vidal, probably didn't really occupy quite the same level of influence among the political left in the United States as Buckley did at the time, but he was absolutely a very prominent writer among the political left. And you can see Buckley in the front of this picture here with Vidal in the background there when they were quite young. or rather young. They had long careers. So, I think this picture was from a show that was done during the 1968 political conventions. But Buckley had started a show called Firing Line, which was sort of like one of the early politics-focused talk shows, sort of like an early version of the McLaughlin Group. I'm not related to John McLaughlin, as far as I'm aware. I mean, I suppose if you go, like, back far enough, we probably both descended from the same, like, leprechaun somewhere in Ireland, but, we're not meaningfully related. Anyway, so there is this reboot of Firing Line on TV right now, by the way, and, you can, but, it's pretty different now, and you can still catch some episodes of that initial era of the show, and my favorite is seeing the debates that Christopher Hitchens had when he was basically like a young and fluffy-tailed journalist. And so, the reason I bring all this up is because I'm a politics nerd, and, as evidenced by my new job, and I actually spent time listening to and watching those, like, antique episodes while doing stereotactic surgeries and stuff like that for my research. And, one of the most interesting things I've taken away from doing so is how similar the issues we debate in modern politics are to the issues that they were debating in that era of American politics, specifically the early 80s. And that's sort of like the germinal argument that Denworth makes in this Scientific American piece. Ultimately, she highlights research that shows conservatives, and again, these American conservatives, they prioritize security, predictability, and authority relative to American liberals. Conversely, this research, which a lot of it comes out of a team of political scientists at the University of Nebraska and Rice University in Houston, this research showed that American liberals tend to be more comfortable with novelty and nuance. So, I suspect, like, many people likely have a kind of reflexive aversion to these kinds of generalities, and I think that's totally justified. That's exactly what these are. These are generalities. There's no one singular definition of a person's politics among the political right or the political left. So someone with politics that tend to fall more on the left of the political spectrum, like in Los Angeles, likely have some differences relative to someone in Austin, Texas. And the same goes for someone on the right end of the spectrum, from, like, the city of Cut and Shoot, Texas, the hometown, by the way, of Bill Brinkley, who was the first to characterize and visualize the kinetochore, which is involved in how chromosomes arrange during mitosis and meiosis, when cells divide. Someone from Cut and Shoot, Texas, a conservative, might have pretty different politics relative to somebody, on the right in Philadelphia or in Boston. So, by the way, Bill Brinkley, the reason I name check him is he was the dean of the grad school at Baylor College of Medicine right before I got there, and he was still sort of, like, floating around the halls. Incredibly brilliant person who's been, like, unparalleled, like, an amazing advocate for biomedical science in the United States. And he told a story of how he had to build one of the first electron microscopes in the country to do his research, and it was just like one of those stories that makes you realize how far we've come in so short a time because he's still alive. Like when you hear stories that the computers that guided, like, the first Apollo mission to the moon had the computing power equivalent to, like, a small calculator, it's just, like, kind of mind-blowing. Anyway, so there are differences among, everyone when it comes to politics, right? We all know this. But we have to start somewhere if we're going to explore this topic, right, scientifically. And so, we have to be comfortable with generalities that don't necessarily map directly onto our own politics just to get a sense of these things. So those are some of, like, the broad strokes of the differences between priorities of people, at least in the United States, who identify as conservatives and liberals. So next, Denworth starts to get into some of the imaging data that distinguish the neuroanatomy of people on the political left and the political right. So she notes that the volume of gray matter, like, meaning the mass of the brain that's composed of actual neuronal cell bodies, she talks about those volumes in the anterior cingulate cortex, and it tends to be greater in people who identify as liberals relative to those who identify as conservatives. And alternatively, the amygdala has been found to have a greater volume, generally speaking, in the brains of people who identify as conservatives. So you can get a sense of where these images reside, where these regions of the brain reside with these two images here. So you can sort of see they're specifically highlighting the anterior cingulate gyrus. But it's the same sort of general area, and you can sort of see in the top one the dorsal ACC, that's like the dorsal part of the anterior cingulate. And then you can see the amygdala. The amygdala it's like one of these regions that's like surprisingly small for how important it is for it to human behavior. But you can see, here AMY is referring to the amygdala, and then right there the word amygdala is pointing to where it is, which is quite close to the hippocampus. So these, are parts of the brain that are involved in a ton of processes. They're not as simple as sort of like they're sort of widely, appreciated as being. But these correlations, and that's what they are, their correlations are at least somewhat consistent. So Denworth acknowledges that there's plenty of variability at play here. As she says, quote, "The political landscape includes lefties who own guns, right-wingers who drive Priuses, and everything in between," which is true. And so she explores a few other sets of research, but one that I found intriguing was conducted in 2013 by Stephen Frenda at UC Irvine, University of California in Irvine. I assume in somebody named Elizabeth Loftus's lab, which is, funny enough, there was a Tom Loftus who was the speaker of the Wisconsin State Assembly. I read one of the books he wrote about his experience as speaker. No idea if they're related, but it'd be pretty fun if they were, right? If they just both kind of ended up doing, politics in one way or another. Anyways, so in this study, it turned out that liberals in the United States were more likely to incorrectly remember George W. Bush being on vacation in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, while conservatives were more likely to incorrectly remember Barack Obama shaking hands with the president of Iran. Neither of those things happened, right? The point is that the study suggested partisan affiliation seems to predict like motivated cognition and memory, predisposing our fallible memories to inaccuracies. So Denworth brings up another interesting study that I'd never seen before, and it introduced me to a new phrase that seems to have existed in the legal world for many years: cultural cognition. So this is a study that was published in the Stanford Law Review, conducted by a group across several law schools: Yale, George Washington University, Cornell, and Temple, here in my beloved Philadelphia. And so cultural cognition is used to describe the unconscious influence of a person's commitments to various groups of which they're a part, specifically in terms of the legal consequences of a given action. So, what they did, they had their subject, part of what they did is they had their subjects watch a video of a political demonstration. And this is pretty cool. So half the participants believed that this demonstration, this protest, was outside of an abortion clinic. So they're protesting the abortion clinic. While the other half thought that they were viewing a video of a protest of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So for anybody who's unfamiliar with what Don't Ask, Don't Tell refers to, it describes a policy in the United States military that prohibited discrimination against members of the military who weren't openly LGBTQ, while at the same time barring membership in the military to people who were open about being parts of those communities. So, the point is that half of the participants thought that they were seeing people protesting at an abortion clinic, while the other half thought that they were seeing people protesting Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So, by the way, I didn't know that law review journals had research like this. Yeah, that's pretty cool. I had no idea. So anyways, the point that Denworth highlights is that conservatives tended to favor calling the police when exposed to demonstrations against barring openly LGBTQ people from joining the military. On the other hand, if the demonstration was against abortion clinics, liberals were more likely to want police intervention. And so, to be clear, like how they did this, they had people read a description of what it was that was happening in the video, and protesters were described as demonstrating as part of those, two groups, right? And so the video itself was 3.5 minutes long, and what this video actually was a recording of a political demonstration in Cambridge, Massachusetts that happened in 2009. So it evidently included a small number of members of the Westboro Baptist Church. It was a very politically active religious group. And it was just like 6 people. And then as well as around 200 counter demonstrators, right? Counter protesting the Westboro folks. So, but, the video was edited to make it look like everyone formed this giant mass of protesters. So, the video also included, clips of cops with helmets on and pedestrians who were clearly like avoiding the demonstration. And so, the point is that everybody saw the same exact video. The only difference was that they received different explanations of what it was. So, as Denworth explains, the more strongly we identify with a party, the more likely we are to double down on our support for it. that tendency is exacerbated by rampant political misinformation, and too often, identity wins out over accuracy. So to be clear, this article from Denworth isn't exactly like breaking new ground. There's literally a post that's hosted on Discover Magazine's site, right, website. I think a blog post that's entitled "Liberals are from the ACC, anterior cingulate cortex, and conservatives are from the amygdala." Like, that's the name of the article from years ago. It was written by a guy named Chris Mooney, but it was written in like 2011. So, Denworth is really an excellent writer. These aren't exactly groundbreaking insights, this whole like ACC liberal, amygdala conservative kind of distinction. And I don't know like just how influential this particular study was, but one of the whole like ACC liberal, amygdala conservative studies was actually commissioned by Colin Firth. Here, wait, let's get rid of this. And no. There we go. So by Colin Firth, like the Colin Firth that Colin Firth, which is, kind of cool. Then I sort of kind of wish that more wealthy celebrities would just like directly invest in biomedical science that way. I guess some do, but it'd be cool if there were more. But frankly, I'd just like to see more scrutiny of this topic by scientists. But I don't know that any deeper understanding of these distinctions would like help to dampen the political turmoil we're seeing, both in the U.S. and internationally. Both because the research that has been conducted, which again, we do discuss on this podcast, but also because I just don't think that the source of turmoil, of all this turmoil, would be like discovered or resolved in biology. But it's definitely worth understanding. So where does this like bird's eye view on the neurobiological distinctions between the right and the left leave us? So first of all, the argument that there might be a neurobiological relationship between the political predispositions people have to like conservative or right-leaning, liberal or left-leaning, like that should not be surprising, right? There's going to be a neural correlate for everything we do. The outstanding question in my mind is just how consistent these correlates are across political affiliations, specifically current political affiliations. Particularly given that, what we're seeing that strikes me at least as some political evolution that's been happening pretty rapidly on both the right and the left. And I'm not talking about like the political ideas, right? They've been around for a very long time, but like what it means to be on the political right versus on the political left. In my mind, there's like a whole other conversation about just how different these new movements really are from like, the ideological roots of political affiliations. But, I'd love to see an update to some of this research according to like more contemporary affiliations. And so, without getting into some of the arguments about like just how different things are today, I've been paying rather close attention to politics over the past few years, and the past few years have been the first time that I've heard Americans, just in general, actually use terms like left and right to describe politics. Like on TV and stuff. On TV back in the day, it was basically like conservative and liberal, right? At least up until like to the presidency of George W. Bush. From like that era up until pretty recently, it was just conservative or liberal. But in the past few years, there seems like there's like quite a bit more familiarity with like the concepts of populism, socialism, nationalism, and like particularly among younger people on the left, the distinctions between like democratic socialists, social democrats, and liberals, and so on, right? And I'm not saying like everybody's on the same page when it comes to those terms, far from it. But they were basically completely absent from political discourse not so long ago. So I think it'd be interesting to explore like some of these questions with people who speak like a more contemporary political language, or at least it's just something more complicated than like conservative versus liberal. So there's another interesting thread of research into the biology of political behavior and affiliation that I find interesting, and it explores how much genetics might account for a person's politics. So, just an example, some groups have compared the political attitudes that people have towards various like politically charged terms, right? So things like nudist camps, horoscope, capitalism, unions, censorship, disarmament, computer music, which is funny, patriotism, the death penalty, right? Things like that, right? Those types of politically charged terms. And they're specifically comparing monozygotic and dizygotic twins, or identical versus fraternal twins. So the reason that those kinds of studies can be so informative when it comes to like behavioral genetics is that comparing these types of twins to each other helps to like get down to just how much genetics may really play a role in this sort of broader political behavior, right? And human behavior in general. And the reason is that identical twins are about as close to genetically identical as two separate humans can be, right? While dizygotic twins are quite a bit more genetically similar, to one another than, any just two random people, but not quite as identical as identical twins or monozygotic twins are. So importantly, though, another reason that this kind of research is so informative is that both identical and fraternal twins share quite a bit of their environmental conditions, right? Like even down to being exposed to the same conditions in the same womb at the same time, right? But also just like generally being raised by the same people in the same household, in the same social situations, right? All of these things can be sort of controlled. So it's a handy way to be able to control for environmental influences, because they tend to be very similar among twins. And so we can ask like how much genetics may account for various behaviors. It's not 100%, surefire method, but it's definitely really handy and sort of one of the gold standards. So groups have found that the genes that people inherited seem to explain quite a bit of people's political traits. So in other words, they found evidence that nature, rather than nurture, seemed to guide the ways that people responded to these sort of political tests. So specifically, they found that the influence of environmental factors exceeded the influence of genetics, so nurture over nature, on only 4 of the 28 tested political traits, right? So that's like very small compared to what I think most scientists, including me, would expect when it comes to something like political traits. And this whole body of research is interesting, and it's frankly still fairly nascent because there's not a ton of activity in it. But they explored a bunch of other things, like how much genetic heredity seemed to account for like how opinionated people were, and it turns out quite a bit. And so here's a quote from that study. Can't help myself. So, quote, "In this particular case, genotype did not make people behave a certain way. Rather, it influenced the extent to which their behavior was contingent on the environment. And this pattern likely will apply to all sorts of other human activities, whether the behavior of interest is depression, cooperation, fear response, or susceptibility to drug addiction. Some people are more sensitive than others to particular features of the environment. And genetics, far from determining behavior, influences its susceptibility." So in other words, this is, again, broadly speaking, genetics sort of sets the stage for how a person is going to respond to any given environmental event or stimulus, and that includes when it comes to political traits, political activity. And so there's a bunch more research that, for example, gets into like how much nature versus nurture guides like how politically active people become, or like how much people participate in like social organizations and stuff like that within their communities. And, interestingly, this research tends to find that when it comes to political affiliation, like meaning like the political party with which a person affiliates, in the United States, Republican or Democrat, or theoretically independent or libertarian, but generally speaking Republican or Democrat. But then in the United Kingdom it might be Labour Party, Conservative Party, Lib Dems, whatever. Those are political affiliations, not the same as political traits. And so, basically what this research shows is like if your parents are Republicans or Democrats, you're just more likely to be a Republican or a Democrat. It doesn't necessarily have to do with genetics. It's just, it's nurture. And there's a ton, and like they go into like things like religiosity and stuff like that. It's really, really interesting. There's a ton more I wanted to get into, but this is already going like pretty super long. So maybe I can do it like another week. But if you're interested, there's a pretty fun review of this whole topic that was published in 2017 by a guy named Darren Schreiber, who's at the University of Exeter, called Neuropolitics 20 Years Later. So yeah, and it's good because he doesn't only review like the experimental evidence, which he does, but he gets into the sort of like scientific history of this whole line of inquiry, as well as a social context in which it developed, right? So funny enough, actually, one of my first neuroscience professors in college, a guy named Michael Spezio, I never really knew, who was at Scripps College, at least at the time when I was at the Claremont colleges. He was one of the scientists who like kind of pushed this whole field of neuropolitics forward, and he was really, really tough when it came to neuroanatomy. So shout out to Spezio. Okay, so getting back to Lydia Denworth's article in Scientific American, she makes the argument that if we come to a deeper understanding of how these differences in reactions operate neurobiologically, we might be able to intervene in this escalation of partisanship. To be honest, I'm not so sanguine as a scientist, as a neuroscientist. I'm not so sanguine. At least, if 2016 was an indication of how much people who disagree with each other actually like meaningfully interact, at least on social media, which you can see here. Let me do that. People basically either only followed like Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, or at least they followed neither of them. And there's basically like no overlap. And so obviously it's not like Twitter is like an ideal representation of how people consume information or news. But given how the news media functions on TV and in newspapers, I'd be pretty shocked if there was like a huge distinction between what that figure depicts and how people receive their politics related information. And if it's an indication of where we were 4 years ago, I can't possibly imagine that we've made any significant progress towards communicating with one another recently, right? If anything, it's probably gotten worse. But then again, maybe that's not even the goal. Maybe it's never been the goal. It's just never happened. That could be possible. I don't know. What strikes me as true is that these disagreements have existed for decades, at a minimum, and probably existed far longer than that. Probably, from the early years of this country, in fact. So, if you haven't heard of Thomas, or of how Thomas Jefferson worked with someone who is basically like a political trickster and propagandist, his name is James T. Callender from Scotland. He worked with Callender to attack John Adams while he was the president, and it's worth exploring that story. Like before John Adams, Callender had attacked Alexander Hamilton, and Callender was even prosecuted under the Sedition Act by the Adams administration. And he received the longest jail term of any journalist prosecuted under the Sedition Act, and was fined $200, which was like quite a lot of money back then, particularly for somebody who wasn't super wealthy. So after Jefferson gets elected, Callender was released and pardoned, but he warned Jefferson that if he didn't appoint Callender the postmaster of Richmond, Virginia, there'd be consequences. So Callender ends up going hard against Thomas Jefferson, publishing stuff about how Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings, which, as we all know now, was true. But like, how different is that from like the various stories we've seen, over the various, about the various candidates over the years? Like, my point is that these political divisions, mudslinging and political chicanery and skullduggery have like been around since the earliest days of this country. And that said, like as cynical as I am when it comes to politics, it feels like there is something else happening these days. And I'm not even referring to like the neuromarketing firms that I describe on the podcast, which for example, like one of them, or actually I think several of them, collect data for like the facial expressions that people exhibit when looking at public campaign posters, like in public. They have like cameras monitoring people, both in the United States and internationally. There's a great article about how this was done in Mexico, I think on behalf of the Peña Nieto administration or campaign. But it's not just Mexico; it happens all over the world. I'm not just talking about like this extra effective theoretically marketing. It just feels like we're coming to a moment where our collective cognitive evolution, where it's not only like physically isolated, like we live in different areas, but like cognitively insulated. And I definitely don't think that like pretending there are similarities between the political left and the political right is a solution, or not, nor pretending that every opinion on a given subject is equally valid just because it's somebody's opinion. I honestly don't really know what the solution is, and maybe there's just always been incredibly deep divisions between different political perspectives, and maybe we're just, the difference now is that we're actually unusually aware of the perspectives of our political oppositions, right? Despite really only consuming information from our preferred news sources. Honestly, I don't know, but what I do know is that research identified neurobiological correlates of right and left-leaning politics many years ago, and I didn't get into all of the creepy like genetic research that explores just how heritable political affiliations and ideologies are, and like suffice it to say, there do seem to be some pretty hardwired predispositions to certain emotional reactions, for example, to our surroundings that may explain or prompt political predilections that we all have. Hopefully we can convince Colin Firth to commission a new series of studies that'll help us to understand, the neurocorrelates that distinguish a right-wing populist from a left-wing populist, and how they're, distinct from other political affiliations. But frankly, I don't think a deeper understanding of the neurobiology of politics will be the cure for all of the tension that we feel right now. And, you know, again, this is coming from somebody who, like, quite literally wants those studies more than some people want to see the next Doctor Strange movie, or one that I'm incredibly excited for, Morbius, which was the first comic book I ever bought myself. You know, I'd love to see more of these studies that explore those questions more than I want to see Morbius, right? But I just don't think those studies will solve the issues that concern pretty much all of us right now. What I do know is that I love living in this country, and I never wish anything bad would happen to anyone else who lives here. You know, like, fundamentally, I think we're in it together, and you know, that the vast majority of people are driven by the best of intentions. So if you haven't already, you know, put on a mask, bring some hand sanitizer, and go vote on Tuesday. And all right, that's what I got. That's what I got for you. Hey, Cheryl. Hey, Frank. National Gluten-Free Sandwich Day. Hey, Hal. Good to see you, man. Interesting. One thing I learned not long ago, and I think we talked about it before. It was what we looked at: anatomical left side of people's faces. Dogs do also. I may have. That sounds vaguely familiar, but that might have been on the episode for facial perception, because we talked about a lot of different studies there, and like a good amount of politics actually. But that's not ringing any bells. Sounds like the flood of information in social media. Yeah, I mean, for sure. Yeah, right. Like, you know, when you think of the whole James Callender story, you know, coming out against Thomas Jefferson, I mean, it just sounds so much like the National Enquirer, doesn't it? Like, except in this case, he was correct. It's a fun story. I would love to read like a biography of that era, or not a history of that era. But all right, why don't we go live? Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Pennsylvania here in rainy, foggy Philadelphia, and on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. I just talked about a series of studies that get into just how hardwired our politics are, our political predispositions, our political affiliations. And I just gave a sort of short kind of review based off of an article that somebody named Lydia Denworth published in Scientific American. So it's not a research article, but every time. But it is she does like a fun review of like the very broad strokes. So youtube.com/anthropoid. Neurologist or psychologist? No, so neuroscientist. So a neurologist is a medical doctor. That's somebody who gets an MD. I don't know. I guess maybe you can get a DL, but, you know, medical degree. And a psychologist can be a PhD. And they are not a clinician. But usually when we use the term psychologist, we're talking about somebody who delivers therapy. You know, there's various kinds of psychological therapy, but they also deliver treatments. A neuroscientist is a scientist. And so we, generally speaking, either pursue a master's degree or a PhD, a doctorate of philosophy, kind of weird. It's kind of like a nice little hangover from the era before science was even a concept, for natural philosophy. And we use the scientific method to ask questions about our about consciousness, try and understand how our biology underlies that consciousness. So different disciplines. Thanks for bringing it up, though. Can a dementia be fatal? Well, so it kind of depends on what exactly you mean by, like, dementia. Like, dementia is caused by dementia is an umbrella term that refers to a bunch of different conditions. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, but it's just one. Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia. And so all of those are more specific explanations that are based off of like what's biologically going on in the brain that's causing the dementia. And yes, like those conditions can all be fatal. But it's not that it's just dementia that caused the fatality. Rather, it is whatever condition they had that is causing the dementia. That is what caused the fatality. Okay. Hey, Clownicans, good to see you. Are there natural remedies for ADD in adults? So when you say like natural remedies, so ADD, now usually called ADHD, is it's a condition. Well, so basically, it's a condition where people struggle to sustain motivation, to focus on a given task for an extended period of time. There are other kinds of manifestations of ADHD. For example, one symptom can be hyperfocus, where people like spend hours and hours and hours like doing, playing a video game, or doing one specific thing, like unusual lengths of time. And so it's been studied now for many years. It's obviously a controversial condition, but at this point, from my perspective, and I'm in the majority among neuroscientists, I think it's pretty safe to say there's enough biological evidence that this is a real thing, and we know we have a pretty good idea of where in the brain it arises, that it's a real condition. So over the years, there have been efforts to try and identify novel treatments for ADHD, because by and large, there's only one real effective treatment for ADHD, and that's psychomotor stimulants, ADHD medication. Hey, Leonora. Adderall, Ritalin, Concerta, Vyvanse, these are all sort of very, very similar molecules. In fact, they're all one of two molecules, amphetamine or methylphenidate. But they, over the years, have been, basically shown to be the most effective treatment for ADHD. And people have tried. I mean, believe me, like scientists, the careers of scientists are motivated such that they would be, whomever would discover this novel treatment that's just as effective, if not more effective for ADHD, would be a made scientist, right? They'd be, they'd get prizes and stuff. But, things, people have explored things like, psychological or behavioral interventions, particularly for younger people, just trying to really, hammer on like various strategies that people can use because like in kids, ADHD oftentimes manifests as like being disorganized, or, their schoolwork, they're struggling in school, or they're like constantly on the go, they're constantly moving and active, or they have like a poor awareness of danger. And so like, scientists and physicians have explored things like psychological intervention, behavioral intervention, and all that kind of stuff. And it just has, and then other things like, some scientists have explored whether other pharmacological treatments could be as effective, if not more. Things like Strattera, selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. I'm pretty sure that like modafinil has been explored, and it just turns out that none of these other treatments have been particularly effective. Or at least, compared to, the ADHD, psychomotor stimulant medications, Adderall and Ritalin. What's the best, well, not the best, but the most compelling evidence is that if you couple some of those other behavioral interventions with ADHD medications, you can achieve the same outcomes with lower doses of the ADHD medication, right? So they're sort of synergistic. And so all of this to say, there aren't really like, and we're talking like bona fide, diagnosed, ADHD, right? We're not talking about, I suspect that I have ADHD just because I have this personality traits that, I associate with ADHD, right? We're talking like physicians, maybe multiple physicians have, diagnosed this ADHD. There just haven't really been a lot of alternative treatments that are as effective. So all this to say, is there a natural remedy for ADHD in adults? None that have been identified, but that's not just for adults. So, okay. My wife was just diagnosed by MRI to have a meningioma. I'm sorry to hear that, Durangus. Sorry to hear that. How do you spell Mississippi? MISSISSIPPI, right? Will the Dolphins retain their lead and beat the Rams? Their lead and beat the Rams. That's funny, because I was like, it's funny how like, initial cognitive states predict for how you interpret information. In fact, I talked a little bit about that on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid, how basically there was this study that, well, to answer your question, I have no idea. But the fact that I read that as lead and not lead tells you all you need to know about what I thought you were talking about. Like, will dolphins accumulate lead in their bodies and, blah, blah, blah. This study basically, and it was published in the Stanford Law Review, this study basically exposed groups of people to a video that was edited that showed basically a political demonstration. And so they basically showed half the people this video and told them this was a protest out in front of an abortion clinic. and then they told the other half of the people that this was a protest against don't ask, don't tell. And so, but the video was the same. And in fact, what the video really was a group of protesters who were counter-protesting a group from the Westboro Baptist Church. And so it was just edited, and it also included video of like police wearing helmets and stuff like that to make it look really rowdy. And it just turned out that that depending on how people were, how this video was described, people would have completely different reactions. So yeah. All right. So how do you spell? Okay. Do we really want to have sex with our mothers? You're talking about like the Oedipus complex. I don't think so. So, but I don't know. I've never seen a study that actually like really scrutinizes whether or not that's a real thing. I don't think so though. It's in a temporal lobe, just 2 centimeters, waiting on treatment options. Yeah, sorry to hear that. Yeah, best of luck. Aneurysm is preventable. That's super interesting, right? Like, aneurysms are one of those things, sort of like what do you call it? Like a solar flare that could just like wipe out all of our whole grid, and there's like literally nothing we can do about it. Aneurysms are kind of like that. Like the difference, though, obviously, is that one is biological. Now, the difference between it being completely unpredictable and having no warning signs, like the difference between that and like a solar flare or like a an asteroid flying through space and it's moving so fast we don't even see it, and then it causes problems. The difference is that aneurysms, first of all, there seems to be a heritable component to aneurysms. So, it tends to run in families, not always, but it also tends to happen more in people with, cardiovascular conditions, high blood pressure, low blood pressure, high cholesterol, like these types of things. So there are some warning signs, but like the reality is like it just happens, and it can just totally fundamentally change your entire, your whole universe. Yeah, it's like one of those things, like those are one of those things that when I learned about it, like sort of kept me up at night. I was like, so what are we gonna do? Like, all right. What about neuroplasticism? So I guess I'm not sure what you mean by neuroplasticism. I assume you're referring to neuroplasticity. So neuroplasticity is, first of all, it's a real thing. Like, and the reason I say that is like, it seems to me that a lot of people don't, their understanding is that this is like a theory, and it may or may not happen, and some scientists argue that it happens and some don't. There's essentially no neuroscientist who would ever try and suggest that neuroplasticity doesn't exist. It definitely exists, and it exists at different domains of neuroanatomy. So it happens at the level of synaptic connections, points of communication between neurons that can change, that are changing right now in your brain as we speak. Happens quite a bit more rapidly and more dynamically in younger people than people my age and older, but it's still happening in my brain. It's still happening in the brains of my daughter's grandparents. But it's not only synaptic connectivity, it's also like the numbers of synapses between neurons, but it can also be like the numbers of receptors for neurotransmitters that are on a synapse that will change the way a neuron will respond to the same amount of serotonin, same amount of dopamine, right? It can be this, where those receptors are in a synapse or on a synapse. They can move. It's sort of like if you were to imagine a pool that's filled with like olive oil, so it's kind of viscous and wavy, and then you throw like life preservers, those little ring floaty things on top. That's sort of how that floaty thing that life preserver can sort of move along the surface of the pool. You can think the surface of the pool as like a neuronal membrane, and so receptors can move along like where they are on the neuron, and that can have consequences for how neurons react to any given signal. So and there's tons of other examples, like the number of AMPA receptors, number of NMDA receptors. The point being that neuroplasticity is just like a fundamental dynamic that occurs within the brain. It's happening all the time, and you can't really directly influence it. Like I see a lot of, I think, misconceptions that like if we could amplify neuroplasticity, that would make us better. That would somehow enhance our performance. And there's there's a germ of truth to that, but it's not really the sort of the most fertile property of our biology that would yield the best outcomes for like performance enhancement. Like just amplifying synaptic neuroplasticity, that could also have dramatically terrible consequences as well. So like So yeah, it's a real thing, and without it, we wouldn't ever really be able to learn anything new. So yeah, can I ask about your thoughts on marijuana and the brain? Of course, Seneca. The short story. Oh, and then Butterow. And then so on a related question, Butterot asks how up to date is science on the effects of LSD, psilocybin, and DMT? So okay, let's start with cannabis, with marijuana. So first of all, it'd be really funny if this dude is really homeless. I don't know how funny that would be, dude. Thank you. No, yeah, I'm in my apartment in Philadelphia. I'm fortunate in that respect. How old am I? Guess how old I am. People used to ask that all the time, and it was funny how like wildly disparate people's guesses would be. But I haven't had the opportunity to ask. Just joking, bro. No, I know. I'm kidding. I'm joking too. Yeah, I've 21. Okay, it's starting off real strong. I liked it, love it. Okay, so cannabis in the brain, marijuana in the brain. So I mean, the I don't know specifically what topic you'd want to discuss, but the short story is, well, first of all, how does cannabis affect the brain? Cannabis is a plant. It has a bunch of molecules in it that have pharmacological properties, and some of those molecules that have pharmacological properties have neuropharmacological properties, meaning that once they get into the brain, they can change the way that neurons signal. And those, the most well-known, well-studied are THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and cannabidiol, or CBD. But it's worth acknowledging that in cannabis there are dozens, some have argued that there are hundreds of other cannabinoids, molecules that are sort of in that same family, as like THC and CBD, like cannabigerol, cannabichromene, that likely have subtle pharmacological effects, not remotely as dominant as THC or even CBD, but they can still modulate the pharmacology of THC and CBD. So there's meaningful pharmacology outside of just CBD and THC. But anyway, so what they do is they get into the brain. Well, let's just focus on THC, because that's like the business end of this psychoactive properties of cannabis. Once it gets into the brain, it binds cannabinoid receptors. So we have receptors that are typically bound by, like every drug, THC binds receptors that typically bind neurotransmitters that are produced in our body. These are called endogenous cannabinoids. Anandamide, 2-DG, there's several. There's a bunch. In fact, the cannabinoid receptor system is one of the most widely expressed in the entire body. These are big honkin' G protein coupled receptors that can influence signaling in a bunch of ways, but the main way, or one of the main ways, is through a process called retrograde inhibition, meaning that once a cannabinoid receptor is bound, then this is a kind of it basically causes other neurons to relax and to stop firing so much. Not always, and cannabinoid receptors can do some really crazy things, like they can dimerize, meaning like basically team up with other neurotransmitter receptors, like so you can have like a CB2 receptor, CB2 dopamine receptor, right, where this like CB receptor, this cannabinoid receptor, like interacts with the dopamine receptor, influencing the signaling of that dopamine receptor. Pretty crazy, right? That's a whole domain of research that if I were going into neuroscience today, I would seriously consider going into. But so, okay, now, I think most people, the reason they're interested in cannabis is because people use it recreationally. Some, of course, use it medicinally. But let's just focus on recreationally. Compared to other drugs that are used recreationally, notably alcohol and nicotine, cannabis, or, cannabinoids, are comparatively, pharmacologically, more benign, meaning they aren't really toxic in the ways that alcohol is, and they're not really as addictive. They are addictive. Don't make no mistake about it. People have a withdrawal syndrome. They will pursue it even in the face of potential or known negative consequences. But it's just not as severe an addiction as what people experience with nicotine. And nicotine, there's only I think one drug that's never been illegal, right? Nicotine. Alcohol was illegal for a period of time in the United States. It was a very, very stupid idea. We should learn from that era, prohibition. But nicotine has never been illegal. Kind of tells you something about the relationship this country has with substances, but tobacco in particular. But anyway, so cannabis, cannabinoids are not nearly as acutely toxic as these other drugs that are legal to consume. Of course, also, for some people, they do have some medicinal benefits, particularly some people with epilepsy, some people with multiple sclerosis find that it relieves a lot of the pain that they can experience. and on and on. I mean, it can be helpful for people. Hey, what's up, Abyss? Good to see you, man. It can be really helpful for people who are undergoing chemotherapy, which is just really, it's super challenging. It's kind of devastating on the body, and it can completely obliterate your appetite. And of course, one of the sort of hallmark effects of cannabis is it gives you the munchies. It increases your appetite. So all of this to say, we talked briefly about the biology, right? Cannabinoid receptors. And now we have just discussed why it is that I think cannabis should be legal for recreational use. And believe it or not, of course, we've seen, across the country, a bunch of states basically legalizing it for either, at a minimum, medicinal use, but also recreational use. And in fact, in New Jersey, in the legislature of which I work now, there will be a ballot question, basically, asking the residents of New Jersey whether or not they should decriminalize cannabis. It's a great thing. I'm glad to see it. It should happen in every state, and the federal government should, step back from enforcing at least that drug law, although there's room for improvement across the board. All right, and then, somebody I think it was like Butterot brought up, is neuroscience or science in general up to date when it comes to the effects of basically psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, and DMT? So it depends on what you mean by up to date. If you're asking so obviously this family of drugs, these psychedelic drugs, are as illegal as drugs can be in the United States. They're what we call Schedule 1, meaning that, basically you might as well be holding a nuclear bomb, like super illegal, right? And that sort of arose out of, the sort of cultural reaction to the kind of hippie movement, people like Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, John C. Lilly, although he was more interested in ketamine and dissociative anesthetics than psychedelics, despite Timothy Leary vehemently arguing that John C. Lilly, who basically invented the sensory deprivation tank, really needs to stop it with the ketamine and go into the LSD. Timothy Leary sitting in his big robes, drinking goblets of LSD. Anyways, there was this huge, backlash to what were perceived as the excesses of this movement, and the psychedelic drugs were sort of one of the mainstays of that movement. And so as a result, neuroscience in particular, but science in general, really did lag behind when it came to. There's a lot of lost time. So are we as up to date as we could be if that didn't happen? No, of course not. There were decades where people either couldn't study psychedelics just because it's so difficult to get permission from the government to do so, or they didn't want to because their career would have been, at least it likely would have been perceived as making their career a little bit less successful. So that said, recently there's definitely been a very rapid increase in the investigation into various aspects of psychedelic drugs, including the basic medicinal chemistry, where specifically in the 5-HT2A receptor LSD binds. Not just that we know it binds the 5-HT2A receptor, but where specifically, what is the medicinal chemistry of the receptor binding event. But then also the potential psychiatric applications. At NYU, there's a study. There have been many studies now into psilocybin. There's a bunch, and so we are making progress. We're making up for some lost time pretty rapidly. So, but there's some really interesting research actually that I saw that came out of, I think, Estonia. There's the University of Pennsylvania has one of these big neuroscience conferences, right? I mean, it's not that big. It's not like Science Society for Neuroscience, but there's a good number of large universities with totally stellar neuroscience departments here in Philadelphia, but people can come from all over the world to present. And I saw this scientist basically presenting her data, exploring some of these rather esoteric, psychedelics and stimulants. These are molecules that have names like MDPV. Or things like that, alpha pyrovalerone. These are drugs that you would never recognize, but they are actually pretty prevalent if you're focused on the right sort of communities. And so people are studying them a lot more. So both the basic science of them, but then also any potential clinical utility. I'd like to know you in person. Well, just reach out on Twitter. I found so much mental relief from psychedelics. It's been life-changing. So say what? Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to psychedelics, I mean, again, just like cannabis, I think they should be legal for recreational use. And in fact, I think it's Oregon that is going to have that question for psilocybin specifically on the ballot. But I do think that, and this was true for cannabis as well, advocates for psychedelics, just like advocates for cannabis, have a tendency to like exaggerate the potential benefits of these molecules. And I get it, right? It's like you're fighting against somebody, or you're opposing people who are saying like cannabis turns you into a zombie that will make you eat people's faces or eat people's brains, like, Reefer Madness style. And, so I think that there is this very understandable reflex to, amplify the benefits. But the reality is, like, you don't need to, right? The standard for legalization shouldn't be it gives you superpowers, right? Or that it cures cancer, right? These are obvious exaggerations. And frankly, it makes the advocacy movement look ridiculous. Like, because then prohibitionists can just say, like, they're claiming that cannabis cures cancer. Like, it's just not true. I mean, it can help with cancer, and there's some evidence that it has anti-inflammatory properties. That's all great. That's fine. But, any scientist, if you were to ask any scientist, does cannabis cure cancer? Like, the answer is no. So when it comes to psychedelics, like, I think your acknowledgement, your anecdotal experience that psychedelics have helped you mentally, that's meaningful, and it's almost certainly one of the reasons that, despite the intense prohibition on these substances, scientists have been interested in exploring these drugs over the years, and now increasingly. You're not alone, right? A lot of people advocate the same thing, advocate that, like, these molecules are helpful in a way that needs to be studied and could potentially be used. But the flip side of it is that, like when people, argue that, like, cannabis has no addictive properties, it's just not true. And it doesn't need to be true for it to be legalized, right? Just like that, when, there are some risks of using psychedelics. This is most abundantly clear when it comes to people with a family history of schizophrenia or psychiatric conditions. But, just in general, it can, promote anxiety attacks, panic attacks. And so, I think rather than saying, like, this is a panacea, I'm not saying that you specifically were arguing this. Just, by the way, I'm just sort of, exploring these waters here. I think it's the best possible advocacy would come from acknowledging the risks, so that everybody is warned, is armed with the best information, but then acknowledging also the potential benefits, like, having a sort of nuanced conversation, which I understand is sort of like asking for the moon. But great topic. I think of genetics as the foundation. This is on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. I think genetics as the foundation blueprint, and epigenetics as the flow control of the expression phenotype, and nurture as the most important demonstrative mutator of nature. I think I'm sort of with you on most of that. So just for anybody that didn't hear in the beginning, on YouTube, before I went live here, I talked about some research that basically kind of explores the neurobiology of whether or not somebody identifies as a conservative versus a liberal. And I got a little bit into some of this really sort of spooky genetics research that explores just how genetically heritable, a person's politics may be, political affiliation and political, like, traits, meaning, like, whether you think, having a very, well-armed military is more or less important than, having, like, universal healthcare or something like that. Did you Google this stuff? No. So first of all, for most of what I've been talking about, I have a PhD, and it's my job to know these things. Most of it comes from reading what's called primary literature, basically like publications that are written by scientists, really for scientists, technical scientific literature. But some of these reviews, actually, I name-checked a review on this whole, like, neuropolitics topic on YouTube. It's totally intelligible to people outside of the field, just because I think the topic of politics is it's more intuitive than, like, synaptic, transmission, right? Or like, like SRE or whatever, medicinal chemistry, like, where you need to know a lot about biochemistry and stuff. So you can check it out. I have it in the description on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. and toss me a sub if you're, interested in these topics. I talk about a bunch of other things too. And so, so when it comes to genetics as the blueprint, I think that is probably the most widely used metaphor. And I think it's right that genetics are basically the blueprint. When it comes to behavior, they set the stage for how you are likely to respond to any given environmental stimulus, be it, being traumatized, like experiencing some kind of trauma, physical, emotional trauma, or, seeing video of, a large group of immigrants coming to a country. Like, the genetics will sort of set the stage for how you're likely to react to that. But of course, the environment also plays a very important role. The issue that I emphasized is that there's evidence that nature plays a much more significant role than I would have anticipated. And this is coming from a neuroscientist who, I think relative to a lot of the field, thinks that nature plays a more significant role in addiction than a lot of scientists think. But I think nurture also plays a very, very significant role. Anyways, so makes me curious, based on your YouTube preamble, what are your thoughts on nature can be mutated or nature is just magnified? I understand I am taking an overly black and white question. Oh yeah, okay. So by and large, we're referring to the nature versus nurture, dichotomy. It's never really one or the other, right? As anybody who, has interacted with me in the past will be sick of hearing me say, pretty much every single thing that you do, every single thing you think, your greatest love, your greatest aspirations, your deepest hate, your deepest anger, are all a byproduct of a combination of genetics, nature, and nurture, your environment. And in fact, there is a more widely used phrase called the gene-environment interaction, meaning a gene in isolation will do its own thing, but nobody really cares. There's no such thing, right? So a gene is only really relevant to us because it exists within the context of the environment, of the world. And so, when you say, so specifically if we're referring to genes, that is the specific definition of nature, then of course the environment can mutate genes, through being exposed to mutagens, when you're exposed to too much UV radiation and you get skin cancer, or exposed to environmental pollutants and stuff like that can cause various kinds of cancer. Then yes, that's true. But I think if we broaden the definition of nature, that the environment can sort of sculpt your predispositions, I think that's true. And epigenetics is one sort of venue wherein that can happen. So if you think of your genome like blueprints, your epigenome is sort of like notes that an architect or contractor or whatever might say, build this door first, put this window, slide this window over there. I know it says on the blueprint, put it there, but actually we want to slide it over by 5 inches, whatever. So in other words, it augments, it modifies how genes are expressed, when, how much, and the epigenome is influenced by the environment. And I'm happy to get into some really cool examples of how that is. But suffice it to say, I think you're pretty much on the right track there. Hey, Exotic Victory. How you doing? All right, let's go back here. Okay. Hey, Elizabeth, good to see you. Okay, have you done or found any interesting topics on cortisol levels? Boy jug. Well, yeah, I've personally done experiments that assess levels of cortisol. So if anybody's not familiar, cortisol is a glucocorticoid. It is, broadly speaking, associated with stress. When your levels of stress increase, you will tend to exhibit or experience increased levels of cortisol. In cortisol, one of the reason for that is that cortisol does a bunch of different things. It's a hormone. And basically, it will induce things like suppressing digestion, because, if you think about how these systems evolved, the main threats in the environment were trying to avoid predators and avoid other Homo sapiens or other primates that might attack, right, imperil your survival. And so, while we don't really experience those threats frequently these days, that same system that was sculpted by those threats is responding to, modern threats like you have to give a talk in front of a bunch of people, or you're debating whether or not you want to hit on someone to whom you're attracted. That stress is operating via the same system, and so cortisol does a bunch of things, like it again inhibits digestion, because if you're running away from a lion, who cares if you don't fully digest the carrot or whatever you just ate. It reroutes blood flow to your extremities rather from your core, part of reducing digestion. But again, it's because you want to make sure that your muscles have as much energy at their disposal as possible, so that you can be really strong, or as strong as you possibly can for that moment, and so on. So I studied cortisol in the context of addiction, and so basically there are a bunch of different ways that you can assess the severity of withdrawal, right? And when I say withdrawal, I mean when people have been drinking alcohol for years and years and years, a lot of it, and they stop drinking, they undergo withdrawal, right? And it's extraordinarily unpleasant. In fact, when it comes to alcohol, it can be deadly. But like one of the things that happens is this amplification of a fight or flight type response, an anxiety response, and that corresponds to elevated cortisol levels. And so my research was exploring whether or not a certain molecule, it's an interesting molecule. It's actually a glucocorticoid receptor antagonist. And for anybody that knows a lot about reproductive biology, you might actually be quite familiar with this molecule. But what it does, it's used for something completely different in society, but what it does is it antagonizes, it blocks essentially glucocorticoid receptors. So I was seeing if we got that drug into a very specific part of the brain during withdrawal, if we could reduce glucocorticoid signaling. And the answer, yes. Not only that, but behavioral manifestations of withdrawal were reduced. So it seems that this molecule, or a molecule like it that does pharmacologically similar things, might be able to dampen the severity of withdrawal from a variety of drugs of abuse, including opioids, alcohol, nicotine, etc. But there's a bunch more too. What do you think about neuroimaging? Do you consider it part of Neuroscientist? Where is that? The handle name is, where is that? That's funny. I'm surprised that you would think I wouldn't. Unless you have taken neuroscience classes, particularly from somebody like me who's more of like a circuits neuroscience kind of guy, because there is this sort of friendly rivalry between cognitive neuroscientists, who generally speaking use neuroimaging, and we're talking like fMRI, PET scan, CAT scan, or not CAT scans really, SPECT scans, EEG, these types of things, versus people like me, who focus mostly on, mapping out circuits of neurons, controlling activities of circuits of neurons, and just more honing in on the more granular details of neurobiology. So there is this friendly rivalry, and they get way more money because everything that they do is more expensive. But it's also more close to what we really care about, which is human consciousness. So yeah, of course, it's a part of neuroscience. Neuroscience is a fundamentally interdisciplinary science. You have physicists, you have chemists, you have biochemists, you have organic chemists, you have psychologists, you have obviously biologists, all working together. Increasingly now engineers working together to ask very similar questions. So there's no question in my mind that neuroimaging, cognitive neuroscience, is a very important part of neuroscience. Thank you so much for the super hearts. I really appreciate it, Elizabeth. That's very generous of you. Let's see. Speaking of nature, what kind of natural herbs affect the brain positively? Well, I mean, it depends on what you mean by like affect the brain positively. I mean, cannabis is some people call it an herb, and it certainly affects the brain. Well, here's one that I think might fall into your domain of interest. Turmeric, whatever. The stuff that is used to make curry has been shown to have what appears to be some pretty, substantive benefits neurobiologically, biologically in general. So I would go with turmeric. That would be the one I would go with. Yes, neuroimaging is definitely part of neuroscience of this. Thank you for that. Does COVID affect the nose or the brain or both? Love this question. COVID and the brain. All right. So here's where we begin. Right. First of all, SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, is a comparatively new virus. Less new these days, right? It's been around for almost a year at this point, but under a year. Prior to SARS-CoV-2, we had SARS-CoV-1, coronavirus version 1, which caused SARS in the early aughts, the early 2000s, mostly in Asia, but it spread.
And then we had MERS, which is like in the same family of coronaviruses. Mostly outbroken in like the Middle East, hence the name MERS. And so after after those viruses petered out, they were studied, and there was some evidence in China that showed that there seemed to be SARS-CoV-1, the virus that caused that initial SARS outbreak. Particles could be identified within the nervous system. So not just where you would expect a respiratory virus to accumulate, like in the lungs, the respiratory pathways and that kind of stuff, but and in other places too, like in the blood and so on, but also in the nervous system. And that's kind of surprising because, generally speaking, viruses have a very difficult time getting into the central nervous system, at least. And so that would indicate that maybe, somehow, we don't know how, it might be possible for some of these viruses to gain entry into the brain. Okay, so we knew that going in, before COVID-19 started. Now, COVID-19 starts, and our perception of it, the best information that we had at our disposal coming out of China and then subsequently coming out of Italy and Europe was this is just a pretty weird but pretty significant respiratory virus. And so as a result, the symptoms are respiratory virus symptoms like coughing, fever, unusually high fever for COVID-19, but fever and extreme fatigue, these types of things. Okay. But as time went on, we sort of began to recognize that there was something else going on there. There were symptoms that, not in everybody, but in some people, seemed to be neurological in nature. So, some people were having seizures. Some people were exhibiting dementia, or, at least acute dementia. People would come into the hospital. This was identified first in Europe, but then it has also been identified in the United States. People would come into the hospital, and the only symptoms that they would be exhibiting is confusion. No fever, no coughing, nothing like that. And so they'd just be evaluated and then just be like, we got nothing for you. We don't know what's wrong. And then they'd come in the next day, similar symptoms, but now they're coughing, now they have fevers, and they test positive for COVID-19. So we don't know for sure if COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 was causing those neurological symptoms, but there's kind of there's good reason to believe it might have. Okay, next, we begin hearing about even stranger, what seem to be neurological symptoms, namely the ones that you bring up. The fact that there was anosmia, some people exhibited anosmia, meaning they lost the ability to smell, and taste was also disrupted, but specifically smell. And that was weird. In my mind, my first reaction was like, this is a respiratory virus. Like when you have the flu, when you have a cold, my sense of taste and smell goes away completely, even if I have bad allergies. Just like those tissues are so swollen that like it's just there's not space. Like literally those molecules can't make it up into there. And so that was my first reaction. Like these are just physicians who are doing a good job of picking up and noting everything that's weird. But now it's become pretty clear that no, there seems to be something specific happening here. Here's what we don't know: whether or not it is a byproduct of SARS-CoV-2 attacking, the respiratory epithelia, like the cells that line the tissues that are involved in our ability to smell and stuff like that. Whether like the virus is like directly attacking those cells, or whether it is the immune system reaction to the infection, which we know is notoriously severe in some people, right? The cytokine storm that you might have heard of. And now we know quite a bit more about, we know more about a possible explanation for why it is that some people react so severely, whereas other people, they don't even know they have it, right? It's an odd component to this virus. So we don't know if it's one of those two things, or if the virus is somehow gaining entry to the central nervous system, perhaps through the nasal respiratory pathways. There is like for example, when people insufflate a drug, there is a small amount of the drug that goes directly into the brain through like nasal biology, right? It's a very, very, very small amount, but it is that has been demonstrated with various drugs, recreational use drugs like cocaine, for example. So the short answer is we don't really know. But there do seem to be enough data that suggests that some people at least have some kind of susceptibility to experiencing neurobiological, very negative reactions to COVID-19 that I am extra vigilant, specifically for my daughter, right? So let me tell you like my sort of nightmare scenario here. You know, it's been pretty well established that you know, younger people tend to be less susceptible to the very severe reactions. They're not immune to it, and there are definitely some young people that have very, very severe reactions, like not Korsakoff syndrome, Kawasaki syndrome, and stuff like that. But by and large, you know, by the numbers, generally speaking, younger people don't react so severely. But here's my sort of nightmare scenario. Let's just say that for some, at least, of these cases of people, you know, exhibiting dementia, having seizures, having neurological reactions, that the virus is somehow gaining entry to the central nervous system. Maybe it doesn't cause, you know, wreak havoc. The immune system reaction in these young people isn't as severe as for older people, and that's great. But it could be, there are tons of viruses, or not tons, but you know, there's many viruses that can gain entry to the central nervous system or to the nervous system, and then basically lay dormant. And in fact, one virus, I would guess more than half of the people participating in this conversation right now have that virus. It's called herpes. Herpes can just, once you have it, you have it. And, you know, basically these herpes viral particles basically reside within your sensory ganglia, like right around your mouth, basically, and just lay dormant. And then every now and then you get stressed out, your immune system is suppressed, you're not getting enough sleep, you're eating poorly, all you're eating is like ramen noodles. And this is abundantly clear when you're teaching in college, because right around midterms, right around finals, all the herpes become visible, right? They all have breakouts. And that's because those viruses just live there, and then there's an opportunity, the immune system is not monitoring for their presence, and then they go and they spread, right? They proliferate and they cause those sores, you know, herpetic lesions. So that's my concern, is that yes, they're okay, like they don't die, they don't have very, very severe reactions immediately, but if it's true that SARS-CoV-2 can gain entry to the central nervous system, that it can remain dormant in their nervous system and at least modify their developmental trajectory, make it so that their brain develops in a way that they normally wouldn't have had they not been exposed. That's my nightmare scenario. I'm not saying that I have evidence to believe that's true. This is pure speculation, but given that more and more scientists, more and more physicians are acknowledging that there do seem to be some neurological components to COVID-19, it's something that I think warrants our consideration. Okay. Sorry, I know that went long, but it's a topic I find interesting. How does B12 deficiency lead to neurological symptoms on a physical level? Skirt. I'm not quite sure on a physical level. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. But I mean, broadly speaking, B12, much like, you know, many vitamins and minerals, the reason that they're important, you know, it's not like, you know, we just have to have this like bucket of, you know, B12 in our body, otherwise we feel bad. It's because a lot of biochemical reactions that occur in the body, making neurotransmitters, you know, making new proteins, these types of things, making ATP, rely on cofactors, rely on, you know, the actual chemical reactions, biochemical reactions, rely on the presence of, you know, choline, on the presence of, you know, magnesium, various vitamins. And that's the role that these vitamins and minerals play. And so when you say vitamin B12 deficiency, which I believe is actually Korsakoff syndrome, that's why. It's because some neurobiological activities that rely on vitamin B12, other vitamins, to occur are deficient because they're just not happening as much as they normally would. So that's why. Greetings from Istanbul. Hello from Philadelphia. I've had COVID. It's why I asked. I think you feel congested rather than that being it. Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, you know, to me that was definitely my first reaction. It's like this. We're being a little bit neurotic about the symptoms of COVID, but the reality is, you know, would I be surprised if you know, SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 had some really specific, very strange neurological effects? No, I would not be surprised. There's a lot of weird things about this virus. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's something we need to take seriously. It's something we need to study more. It's difficult to study, you know? Okay. Is there any evidence that consciousness is anything other than a byproduct of brain activity? Bergie for hire. Great topic. You know, the short answer is there's not a lot of convincing evidence that consciousness resides in some other substrate beyond the brain. You know, I think if you're looking for the best made arguments in favor of that, in favor of like a pseudo dualist kind of like, the mind certainly is related to the brain, but it's not exclusively related to the brain, then I would look at a philosophical concept called compatibilism. Wait, what is going on here? Strange. Okay. Compatibilism. The best I think to read would be Daniel Dennett. Patricia Churchland has some stuff on. She doesn't. It's not really compatibilism. I mean, it sort of is, but she's specifically concerned with free will and whether or not we even think about free will in a coherent way. But I would look at Daniel Dennett. He's probably the most articulate. He's evolved over the years on how he expressed compatibilism and dualism and stuff like that. But basically, from my perspective, just if I were to come to a conclusion about whether or not the mind resides somewhere else other than the brain, purely on what I have personally observed in my own experiments, it would take a lot to convince me that there is some other explanation. Because I can tell you, I know how to make a mouse or a rat, theoretically a human, just walk around in circles for hours, just hours and hours and hours. That's all they're doing, just walking around in circles. I've also participated in an experiment that made a mouse just in a moment, like let's say like an on and off switch, do the same thing, like move in this direction, stop, and then I turn off the switch, and then they their fluffy tailed selves, and then flip the switch on, and they're moving in that direction again. It's just like this very strong one-to-one, and the only reason that happened was because I was controlling the activities of like a very specific set of neurons, like the tiny minority of all of the neurons in the brain, but I could just control behavior completely. And so that's just one example. I know what the counter argument would be. That's just a very simple motor output, but why would you ever believe that anything else that is part of consciousness would be different, right? So that's my perspective. I'm not a dualist. I think most neuroscientists at this point are not dualists. Some are compatibilists. I think David Eagleman is also maybe a compatibilist, and maybe a closeted compatibilist. But yeah, I'm a pretty hard determinist, and yeah. Happy to talk more about that if you'd like. I've been going into that. Let me guess, D1 and D2 striatal neurons. No, so Abyss is referring to, so basically we have different kinds of dopamine receptors, and they can be they all fall into like two categories, D1 type and D2 type. One is excitatory and one is inhibitory, and D1, D2 striatal neurons basically are some of the most important pathways that control movement. No, this was probably the substantia nigra compacta, and or I think the VTA, but then also the anterior dorsal thalamic nucleus. Very interesting because that actually controls your attention. But anyways, okay, Titan in Brazil, what's up?
See, no speak English.
I'm sorry, I wish I could speak Portuguese, but I don't. Yeah, that's too bad. I really do wish I could speak Brazilian Portuguese specifically. It's so beautiful. Do you believe properly practiced breath work impacts our sympathetic nervous system within our gut? I don't know why you'd go with within the gut. There is definitely evidence that certain kinds of breathing techniques definitely have an effect on your state of mind, and then also body states like levels of cortisol, for example. So yeah, that's for sure. But I don't know about I'm not quite sure what you're referring to when it comes to within the gut. Looks like we're struggling to connect here. Yeah. Maybe if you want to try calling back in, we might be able to successfully connect. This molecule, is it found in pharmaceuticals and fruit? If it helps with addiction to alcohol, was there a success rate? I'm not sure which molecule you're describing. Okay, calcium imaging is also used as well among neuroscientists as well. Just saying, yeah, we did calcium imaging. In fact, my protege in the lab is working on some fibrophotometry, and then she's going to do in vivo microscopy with calcium imaging. I think if she pulls this off, that there are a few experiments that were done in my lab that were more technically difficult than the ones that I was doing. In fact, I would say none. But she was my protege. She took on these types of experiments. If she pulls off this experiment she's going to do, she will have conducted the most technically challenging experiment in the lab. And I will applaud her. I would be happy to have my record broken. Looks like we're connected. What's your name and where you're calling from?
Hi, my name's Alex. I'm calling from North Texas, north of Dallas.
Awesome. Alex in north of Dallas. What's on your mind?
I've called it here like a couple of years ago, but what's on my mind recently is something I found interesting about, I think, what I would consider my personal development, just like clarifying what my behavior ought to be, clarifying what my responsibilities are, just as a civilian, as a person. And I think it starts with, it honestly started with an experimental phrase that I would keep applying to things. And it sounds kind of like, I don't know how it sounds, but essentially I look at my surroundings and I make the words hyperinferential logic. Like, those 3 words reinforce how I think about the world, and it helps me, like, given a data set especially, but given that, or given a context, like, my first thought is, where am I, what's going on right now, and what can I infer about this context, given the data sets that I'm receiving through technology, or what have you. And then based on this sort of like equation of sorts in my head, I deduce what the fitting behavior or words ought to be, especially when it comes to like
Politics, yeah.
Especially when it comes to politics, especially when it comes to the economy, especially when it comes to just relating with more human beings, in a way that transcends differences, like transcends sort of pockets of humanity that, might be, I guess,
with whom you might disagree.
Disagreed, or like, might be distanced from another sector of human beings that, have a different ideology. So, like, I don't know, just in an attempt to be more well-rounded, I suppose, I've, introduced the phrase hyperinferential logic just to my ongoing thought life.
So it's interesting. So first of all, so you came up with that phrase, hyperinferential logic?
I think so, but
okay, yeah.
These days I have this feeling that a lot of my thoughts are coming to me from other sources that I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I literally think that there's a machine out there. Like, seriously, I don't know if it really is, but I have this feeling that there's some kind of machine that the government's working on, and they're sending these signals, or they're dialing something, and their thoughts are coming through my head.
Well, I mean,
I really believe that.
Well, I would augment that by suggesting that there's no machine. It's just how media is consumed in this country, right? I mean, you don't need that machine. But so anyways, I mean, basically what it sounds like is this concept is basically like getting meticulous about your decision making, trying to make as much of your decision making like conscious rather than subconscious, right? And listen, I applaud that totally. I think that's beneficial to scrutinize like why you made a decision, why you feel a certain way about any given political issue or any given group. I think that's healthy, and it's exploiting the fact that we have these big fancy Homo sapien brains. What's I think frustrating as being a Homo sapien, a fellow Homo sapien, is that we are notoriously bad at actually understanding why we do the things we do. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a great idea. Yeah, you should write it up.
I should. I've been trying to start this. I started this Facebook page, and I started getting a merch store going and all this, and I made this whole vision statement on the about page of this Facebook, the weird thing is I embedded this idea so deeply into like merch stores, like getting it printed up, getting a vision statement on a T-shirt and just wearing my phrase on a T-shirt. For instance, like the vision statement is literally the page is called Phenomenology, and the vision statement is decrypting the complexities of the internal, external, and interdepartmental techno-contracts of corporate finance through hyper-inferential comp logic. Like, that is the vision statement. I know that sounds insane, but essentially, it's, like, because I embedded this, like, ideas so deeply online with the website, like, what's really strange is like this algorithm started like resurfacing. QAnon fool. Like what I mean by algorithm is that I don't know if it's a real algorithm, but essentially I started getting a weekly follower base from universities, like a lot of people in India, a lot of people around the world, and most of the followers all have psychology, philosophy, or computer science in their about description.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, man. Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I congratulations. That's wonderful. Listen, man. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting idea, and I look forward to reading a blog post explanation for how it'll be how it could be applied. So thanks for calling in, Alex. I appreciate it.
Thanks, bye.
So, hyperinferential logic. Just, remember that. Remember that phrase. No, I think it is, like, at least from my understanding, I think it's a totally worthwhile endeavor to, like, really make intentional decisions as given what we understand about even decision making, whether or not we even make them. But, okay, getting another call from a wacky foreigner. Wacky foreigner, what's your name and where are you calling from?
I'm Avi. I'm calling from Virginia. We've actually spoken last year one time about addiction.
Oh, cool. Oh, awesome. Okay. So Amabi, is that right? Avi. Oh, thank you. Okay, so Avi in Virginia. What's on your mind this time?
I have a question. It's addiction related. So my son, as you probably don't remember, he struggles with Xanax addiction.
Okay.
And usually it escalates to Percocets, and he had a very bad overdose in May, and he was able to sustain recovery for about, I would say, 4 months, and now he's again relapsed. But fortunately, he's been very responsible. We caught it early on, so he's in detox, and we're hoping to get him into rehab, which might be a month long. So in his brain, he believes, and this is where, and I know you cannot give advice, but we can speak in generalities. So he thinks that, and people have recommended to him, some of them, that hey, if you take marijuana, that's a lot safer than taking the kind of drugs that you're taking, which are synthetic. Me personally, I don't think an addict can possibly stick to just marijuana, but I'm not sure what your view is, what research shows in your field.
I love that you bring this up. So first of all, I'm sorry to hear it. I mean, I know it's called comfort, but that kind of a story when it comes to addiction is the norm. I mean, it is what makes addiction so such a frustrating condition. And so, but it's comforting to hear that you all are being like proactive about trying to get some treatment and some assistance. So specifically when it comes to cannabis, there was actually a study that was published in Clinical Psychology Review, specifically about
Clinical psychology. Okay.
Yeah. If you're on Twitter, just send me a DM and I'll send you a link.
All right, sir.
The relationship between cannabis use and patient outcomes in medication-based treatment of opioid use disorder, a systematic review. So it's a review of, this is a question that has come up many, many times over the years, which is, people who go to, rehab or try and get some treatment for, maybe they go to like a, medication-assisted treatment like methadone or Suboxone or something like that for opioid addiction. Should we put cannabis in the same category? And should, smoking weed be considered a relapse? And I think your suspicions that, if one begins smoking pot, then that might sort of make them a little bit more likely to indulge in other substances. That, frankly, would be my intuition. But basically the short story of this review is that in most studies, cannabis did not significantly predict treatment outcomes, meaning that there were some studies that indicated worse treatment outcomes, and some that identified improved treatment outcomes. But by and large, it really didn't play a significant determinative role. This was just published. I think. It's gonna be published in December. So.
So Dr. Ian, just a quick question: is this for people who already have addiction?
Yes.
Because interesting. Okay.
Yeah,
so
and
is this for opioid? My son is addicted to Xanax, which is a benzodiazepine.
Yeah.
He's also addicted to opioids, so he's on Vivitrol, which has been helping him. But I was wondering specifically about benzos.
Yeah. Of course, benzodiazepines have different pharmacology and everything. But if somebody is using, let's step back and just acknowledge really quickly that the combination of benzodiazepines and opioids is a rather dangerous combination.
Very,
it's up there, maybe the most dangerous combination of widely used recreational drugs.
His overdose was pretty bad. He almost turned blue, and they had to do 8 Narcan shots to revive him.
Wow. Yeah. That's wonderful that Narcan was available. That is like one of my crusades in my new job is to try and expand access and prevalence of Narcan. Every house should have some Narcan. Every first aid kit should have Narcan in it. It's great that you already know that. I'm not surprised. You sound like you're very aware of this whole world. But basically, if I were in similar shoes, I wouldn't conceive of this addiction as a benzodiazepine addiction or an opioid addiction. It's polydrug addiction is probably what a lot of people would call it, but
right.
it's addiction. And what we're talking about with this review of studies is medication-assisted treatment. So these are,
that's what my concern is.
Yeah. So these are people who, were addicted to an opioid of some sort, and again, they went on methadone or they went on Suboxone. There might have been other medications that were used. I'm not sure. I haven't looked at all the studies that they review. So, I know that there are a lot of different opinions on how opioid addiction in particular should be addressed, should be treated. There are folks who argue that there is no such thing as a successful treatment of an opioid addiction if somebody is still using an opioid, meaning that you're not successful if rather than having somebody achieve abstinence, they're on methadone or they're on Suboxone. Frankly, I find that to be an antiquated perspective. It has been the norm in this country, and things have only gotten worse. I mentioned this, I think, last time, but as of March of 2019, or 2020, just a couple months ago, from 2019 March to March of 2020, the greatest number of people were lost to drug overdose fatalities in the history of this country.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so it's about 75,000. And then, frankly, I think this year, January of 2020 to, let's say, December, I think it's going to be, we have no idea how much higher it's going to be, but it's almost certainly going to be higher given what we're seeing from the effects of COVID-19. And so, from my perspective, I'm not just speaking purely as an academic, right? Like, I have family experience with this concern.
Okay.
And for close family friends, obviously opioid addiction is becoming increasingly prevalent, so it's perhaps unsurprising, right? My perspective is, medication-assisted treatment is life-saving.
Yes.
Yeah. So I would engage some kind of addiction medicine specialist if you're in a position to be able to do that, and talk about this. That maybe it is the case that he almost exclusively uses benzodiazepines, but every now and then uses opioids, or he's really using both most of the time. In which case,
right.
treat.
It usually progresses to both. He'll start off with Xanax, and then it'll progress to Percocet, then he'll add more stuff to it. And it's funny because over 2 years of advocacy, I went from it should be complete abstinence to now being more open to medically assisted treatment. And at the end of the day, this is what I have to say, and I understand where 12-step program comes from and where people like me, when I was at a different point of my life, come from. We would like to see absolute abstinence, but I'd rather have a functional son who is living his life as opposed to a son who's dead and not living at all.
I 100% agree with you. I couldn't agree more. I think these are life-saving medications, and the evidence is pretty clear that the benefits of MAT are substantial and almost always more effective. But anyways, yeah.
Thank you for answering. I will send you a message. Please do share the research, because I'm very, very interested in research about this.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, this. Let's see. I think they're a group out of British Columbia. Canada also is experiencing, similar challenges. But listen, Avi, I mean, I'm sorry to hear it, and my heart goes out to you. I totally empathize. And so, best of luck, and let me know how things go.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much.
Thanks for calling in. Yeah. It is so frustrating. When you're trying to advocate for policy, that's my new job, right? When you're trying to advocate for policies that there's so much evidence would reduce overdose fatalities, and there is just this cultural, almost like a religious devotion to not allowing this to happen, to not allowing people to use medications to treat a biological condition, right? The National Institutes on Drug Abuse, the federal government's primary research agency devoted to addiction, recognizes addiction as a brain disease. They call it brain disease model of addiction. There's an interesting semantic debate there, and you just come up against this like zealous opposition. I think that there's so much emotional investment in that from people who are also personally affected by addiction. But it's frustrating. It's that number of people did not need to be lost from March of 2019 to March of 2020. It didn't have to happen. It doesn't have to continue happening. We have answers. We have solutions that we could apply, and yeah, it's frustrating. And to be clear, like, I'm not saying only one political party is like the opposition. That's definitely not the case when it comes to this issue. And addiction is a bipartisan concern. At my new job, you have both Democrats and Republicans supporting these bills, fortunately, but it's just we're not going as far as I would like to go as quickly as possible, as quickly as I would like to go. Yeah, I'll shoot you that study. Hello, hey, what's up, Oleg? Good to see you, man. If you're still here. Okay, I have pernicious anemia. Body doesn't create blood because stomach doesn't create intrinsic factor, which helps to absorb B12. Lack of B12 destroys CNS and causes 3x stomach acidity. I didn't know about the acidity. Frank, I'm sorry to hear that. Jeez. One of the symptoms, one of the manifestations of very, very severe alcoholism, we're talking like very, very severe, completely debilitating amounts, is a reduction in the absorption of vitamin B12, and that can manifest in this odd thing that humans do called confabulation, where they will give you answers to questions. They're wrong, like the answers are wrong, so they're objectively lying, but they don't think they're lying. They 100% believe what they're saying, which is just, it's so wild. But and it's basically because of how the ethanol is disrupting their vitamin and mineral absorption. Yeah, pretty strange. Sorry to hear that, dude. Oh my god, at least someone is live. I thought everyone was dead. What are today's topics? So today we talked about the relationship between, I don't know why I just went Scandinavian, but the relationship between politics and neurobiology, politics and genetics. It's just a brief sort of treatment of the topic on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. Right at the beginning. The whole beginning is just that. Where's the thing? Aha, here we go. How to make crystal meth. What tools do I need to make good stuff? Crystal meth? Man, that sounds like a cool math. Crystal meth, methamphetamine, is actually surprisingly easy to make. Like, pretty much anybody who has taken, like, organic chemistry and, like, didn't fail, they could totally figure it out, how to make it. And it's so simple, like, which is part of the reason that crystal meth was, like, not the first, but, like, one of the predecessor, epidemics of drug use in the United States before opioids. Is meth bad for the brain? Yes. Meth is objectively bad for the brain. I assume you're referring to methamphetamine, not methadone. Some people call methadone meth, which can be quite confusing. But no, methamphetamine, definitely, it can induce something called excitotoxicity, where it drives dopamine neurons to fire at, give me your crystal meth, to drive those dopamine neurons to drive levels of activity that are just far and beyond what they would ever normally be able to do. Oh, geez, yeah, so Elizabeth keeps losing her sound. That's super frustrating. I don't know why that would be. Because I think the connectivity is fine, but sorry about that. So these dopamine neurons firing at excessively high levels, and it can cause excitotoxicity. It can cause dopamine. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter itself is rather reactive as well. So yeah, it is. It's bad. It's bad. Okay. Speaking of which, do you know if there are labs that use optically pumped magnetometry for neuroimaging? I don't think so. There was this technique, I forgot the name of it, where they would basically inject like magnetic beads, I think. I can't really remember the details, but like at the beginning of my PhD, optogenetics was still pretty new. DREADs were definitely very new, or chemogenetics. And there was like Razzles, there was, TRPV1 based, remote control of neurons, whatever you want to call it. And then there was this other one where like you could, basically it could make it so that you could inject this stuff or insert this stuff, and it would enter, I believe, it would somehow interact with like ion channels, so that you could control neuronal firing with like radio, I think radio waves. Might have been magnetics. I can't remember. But I remember thinking like, that is a totally crazy platform, and I love it. Like, that is such a great idea. Very funny though. Hey Haley, good to see you. I thought I heard someone say laced. Wonder what he's trying to say that I don't know about. Foaming through the mouth, right? I saw you say that. Foaming at the mouth? No. I don't know what you mean. Sounds like a TIA after blood clots. Oh, I must have missed something. Completely killed my sense of smell. I'm getting it 8 months back later. So Drew said that he lost his sense of smell from COVID, I believe. Yeah, that is one of the weird like aspects. That one of the reasons that I suspect that there might be some neurobiological component to COVID. That like the fact that people have this anosmia and it persists for many months, like beyond, no more fevers, no more coughing, no more any of that stuff, and this one symptom is persists, is weird. It's weird. That's all I'll say. And like I can't really think of a mechanism. That's the weird part of it. Like, is it just halting, receptor trafficking or neurogenesis, factory bulb? Is it like something like that, which would be bad? Or, is there just like this sustained, is the complement system just in overdrive, and it's just elevated at this level consistently, and so you just continue getting this inflammatory signaling at olfactory sites, and therefore you just don't smell. I don't know. There's a bunch of different possible mechanisms. Saw this coming because I could see it and sense it in the data. I know that feel. Does sleep deprivation permanently damage the brain? Stop chasing me, the handle. So does it permanently? So it definitely can be associated with changes in neuroplasticity that can be very long lasting. So like sleep deprivation can affect like synaptogenesis in the hippocampus, things like that. Gosh, my nose. You know what happens? Once I itch my nose the first time, whenever I'm in these live streams, it just stays itchy. And if I don't itch it ever, then it doesn't continue. It doesn't get itchy. It's so dumb. This frustrating Homo sapien body. Herpes virus latency is way different and programmatic. No evidence that coronavirus has latency phase. Well, squirrel. I mean, how long have we been studying herpes virus? Like decades? I mean, maybe the notion that just because we don't yet have evidence that COVID has any kind of, or SARS-CoV-2 has any kind of latency period means that it doesn't. I mean, that's absurd. That's an absurd stance to take. Like, that's just not how science works, right? I'm not saying that SARS-CoV-2 has a latency period. Like, not at all. In fact, my suspicion, my initial hypothesis would be that no, there is some kind of immune system reaction to SARS-CoV-2 that is for some reason chronic. It becomes chronic. But like initially, SARS-CoV-2 was just a respiratory virus. And now we know that it does a lot more. Like, and why would it be, if it can, infect, if it can gain access to your circulatory system, and it can infect a bunch of different organs, can cause multi-organ failure, if it can, basically, something that looks like sepsis, why would it be totally outrageous that it would have some other latency period? And like, the differences between what SARS-CoV-2 and SARS-CoV-1 can interact with, the difference in receptor interaction, I think is meaningful, and I think we're going to find like there's some weird genetics going on here, like the fact that some people's complement system reacts completely differently than others, and actually I believe that they identified some specific single nucleotide polymorphisms that could predict those reactions. So I mean, I'm sorry, like I just don't think that's a I wouldn't be so confident about that, is what I'm saying, I guess. But hey, you could totally be right. Like I don't mean to suggest that it definitely has that, right? I'm just saying, like, I wouldn't be surprised. It has that characteristic. I wouldn't be surprised. And this is like the reason that I think maybe I'm a little bit more open to these like arguments than maybe other people is like, when I learned how little we understand about the viruses that I made, how they actually work, how they actually, like, the specific pathways of how they infect a neuron, when I learned that we know so little about that, then, like, come on, like, we barely understand anything about this virus, or we understand a lot about it, but there's still plenty to be understood. Thank you so much for the super hearts, Elizabeth, I believe. I'm doing a PhD in neuroimaging. Would I be considered a neuroscientist as well? Yes. Okay. Greetings from Istanbul. Are you Russian, bro? I am not Russian. I'm American. I think it's just an economic failure more so than some bad flu. Are you don't love Russia? You ghost, brother. I have no problem with Russia. I mean, I don't like love Russia either. It's just a country. Good people live there. Right on. You're fired. What? Okay. Like with many men, I'm afflicted with my consciousness living in my genitals. Yeah, a lot of people have that. Oh, wow. I'm super behind. Oh, geez. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay. Did you snort or shoot? I did neither. With anything. Benadryl for itches. Yeah, but then I'd be super tired. I think it's purely psychosomatic. I don't think it's actually... You mean my nose itching? Like, yeah, I think it's just a weird thing that, like, once I start doing, I think it's kind of similar to when, if you prime somebody by saying, you say way too much, and they've never really thought about that, they'll completely alter the way they speak because they're like attempting to avoid the word or it's sort of like, how many times, what is your breathing frequency right now? How many times are you breathing every 5 seconds? Like, all of a sudden you're like consciously thinking about breathing, and it's like, now I don't know, should I be breathing like this now? Like, I think it's just one of those things. At one time, were you in recovery? I was not. You are now manually breathing. Yeah, exactly. Right. That's what I was saying. Yeah. Answer my question. Your body language says a lot. Are you using? Am I still using? York, first of all, I don't owe you an answer to any of these questions, but the answer is no, I'm not still using. I don't really know what you're talking about. I wasn't using before. You know what that question is like? It's like, when did you stop beating your wife? Okay. Keep them in prison. That's likely where they'll end up treatment and more medicine. So there's not a lot of evidence for that. Okay. Therefore, present an opportunity to create new ways of thinking and seeing errors in the old ways. If narcotics are so bad, why are they still on the market? Well, I mean, just because something's legal in the United States doesn't mean that it's okay. As we've learned from watching the whole trajectory of the Purdue Pharma Sackler family, OxyContin legal battle. Narcotics, it's kind of an unfortunate term because it's not really like a formal like designation. It really just means like illegal drugs. But yeah, just because something's legal doesn't mean, tobacco is illegal, but it's definitely bad for you. So Abyss, what's on your mind, man?
Hey, Ian, how's it going?
Not bad. How are you?
Not bad. So I just wanted to give some clarification about the optically pumped magnetometry.
Okay.
So it's basically where it's like MEG, like that's like
MEG. Yeah.
MEG, and instead of having like a bunch of arrays of squids that actually amplify the electrical impulse that can be read through like typically your EEG cap, but essentially producing a magnetic field. So they use some kind of quantum mechanism to essentially kind of create magnetic coherence in some kind of dye so that they can reduce the amount of interference in the system.
Yes.
It's actually relatively new, so that's why I asked like if it's applicable in neuroimaging, because I haven't seen or haven't come across any lab that actually uses it.
I had sort of minimal exposure to neuroimaging in general. Like I think Penn is like a lot of other places where the cognitive neuroscience folks basically just hang out with themselves, and the rest of us hang out with each other. And so, every now and then I would like to at least go to a talk. My friends weren't even in cognitive neuroscience, like in grad school. So like apart from taking classes and, reading, the studies, I didn't really have a good sense of where, of like what was cutting edge, let's say, in cognitive neuroscience. Like I was exposed more to, the more cutting edge stuff was like, in vivo microscopy using, like we were talking, calcium imaging or these types of things. So frankly, I don't know.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify because this is also new to me. Even though I've done imaging with NIRS and a few other modalities, but this is actually quite new to me. I'm actually studying it, so I just wanted to clarify that it's not actually the radio wave kind of optogenetics that you're talking about. It's actually kind of it's a bit different than that. I just wanted to clarify that.
Well, yeah, it sounds cool. Yeah, I would definitely have to look into it because like, yeah, I had minimal exposure. Are you just studying it just as a part of your program or whatever, or are you actually going to potentially use it?
No, I mean just a general curiosity.
Okay.
Because some are saying that it's going to be revolutionary, because if you really think about it, like how MEGs can be like really bulky, right?
Oh yeah.
And there was some breakthrough that actually reduces the magnetic interference from Earth, because that's the major part that you have to get rid of, is as a potential noise that interferes with your signal. So they did make breakthrough in that. But if you can actually harness, or at least I can get a good data or good results or good imaging using just the magnetic fields that those pyramidal cells that actually produce the cortical area, then that will be most advantageous. But the problem was like reducing the entire bulk, because the squid array is really huge, right?
Yeah.
And it will be nearly impossible to apply that in a clinical setting on a regular basis. So this is, I think, one of the advantages that people that are working on this optically pumped magnetometry are saying, that it could revolutionize how we do imaging, or at least like cortical imaging. So that's why I'm kind of interested.
Yeah, no, that does sound interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess, most of the research that I was exposed to directly were like people who are on the same fellowship that I was on, or was it teaching? Was it T32? Whatever that is. And they were working on just like using, pharmacologically improved, fMRI, or no, actually just MRI, using molecules that would accumulate at certain targets that would be, you could image, right? That was like, it was just some like straight up chemistry stuff. Frankly, kind of boring to me, but that's just me. But anyways, yeah, no, that sounds cool, man.
The problem with fMRI is actually it has a long time delay. Right?
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah. So the time resolution is actually pretty large.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
As opposed to like EEG or something. So I think this would be a better alternative. I don't know if it's like it's fully formed yet. It's actually on in progress. Like there are some labs that are producing some results. It's mostly theoretical at this point.
Okay.
But not theoretical. I mean, they do have devices, not just theoretical. But yeah, I would really like to see where that goes as part of neuroimaging.
Yeah, no, that sounds cool, man. Interesting. Thanks for bringing it up.
No problem, man.
Talk to you soon. Abyss, bring in the good stuff. Bring in the substance. I love your office. Thank you very much. I do too. I am a big fan of making sure your work environment is enriching and feels good. My wife is like the opposite. Like she would just work in a white room with nothing on the walls, with like all you can hear is just like the air conditioner in the background. Like she's like a cyborg that way. Which is good because then she doesn't have very strong taste, aesthetic taste. So I could just sort of like, this painting is gonna go there. Okay, how do I get rich quickly? I think go to work in the finance world. Go to work on Wall Street. That's probably your best bet, at least for now. Do you prescribe to medication? Like, am I prescribed to medication? I am not. I'm looking right through you. You are still using. Yes, no. Why are you so concerned about that? I am not using any drug, any substance. Like, what are you talking about? Are you hiring for a helper? I don't have the spare cash. You know what I would love, though? I wish I could, because when it comes to YouTube, like, what I really should be doing is clipping parts of the live stream so that they're separate videos. Like, that would be so helpful. But I just can't offer any income, and there is no income. So, but if you have spare time and you need something to do, reach out. Okay. Would you like to improve your production? Yes, I would, but same problem. DME, okay. Yeah, legal doesn't equal good. See, that's true. Oh, wacky, yes, Avi. And also, natural doesn't equal good. Same, for the same reason. What is going on over here? It's so frustrating. Okay. When did you stop what? Do you believe in body language? Yes, sort of. I mean, I sent you a Twitter DM. Okay, great, Avi. Yeah, I'll send that to you. I'll send that to you like right when we're done here. You must be new to science if you are not aware of how little we understand. Yeah, no, you're right. You're right. Spending over a decade studying the brain and doing my own research, spending 14, 16-hour days in the lab multiple times, publishing novel findings. You're right. You probably, maybe you're in science and, far be it for me to lecture you, but somebody outside of science probably has a better grasp of like the state of the field. Anyways, can I find you on Twitter with the same Periscope username? I listen, there's great job security in neuroscience. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's still plenty to learn. There's a ton to learn. I think people exaggerate how much we don't understand a little bit, but is that a background screen or your view? That is, that's a window. That's a window out to beautiful Philadelphia. And in fact, if you were here earlier, you would have seen that it was raining. And now it's not raining. That's not just like a really fancy backdrop. Are you going to write a book on these topics? I've been wanting to. I have like 3 ideas for books, but I don't know how to write a book. I know how to write, but I don't know how to like get a book published. I think it's actually quite difficult. But yeah, I have several ideas. I have an idea for like pure science fiction. I guess you might call it high science fiction, like nitty-gritty science fiction, sort of like William Gibson style. In Logan Square. But then I also have just like what would basically be an update to a pretty good book called You Are a Strange Loop, I think is what it's called. I would do a sort of update to that. Yeah. So, but I don't know how to do that. Hey, if you know anybody who like decides who gets to write books, let me know. Hook me up. Do you think vestibular rehabilitation is effective for treating vertigo? You know, I don't know. I've never seen any like assessments of efficacy. I assume. I guess I'm not quite sure what you mean. There is this really interesting. I don't know if this is the treatment to which you're referring, but there is this interesting. Like when some people get vertigo or when they get just like spontaneously dizzy and stuff, there's this really weird treatment that basically involves like moving your head in certain like orientations at certain times. And basically what you're trying to do is influence where like otoliths are, where the little like calcium carbonate nuggets that like move around in your semicircular canal and your otolith organs, where they are. And so, yeah, it's kind of crazy, and it does work. It totally does work. I mean, for some cases, not for all cases. One more time. I really need to know the answer. Will it ever be possible to cure depression in the brain, and how? So 2020 is trash. Yeah, I agree with you there. Yes. I mean, the short answer is yes. I am very confident that at some point we will come up with a treatment that is significantly more effective than our current treatments. And so there's cause for optimism there, but it's excessively difficult. It's one of the hardest problems in biomedical science to solve, because not only is the brain like the most complicated organ, you know, it does a lot of things. It doesn't just like produce insulin or pump blood, you know, right? But then also depression and mood arises from this really disparate circuit of a bunch of different structures within the brain. And they're not all the same. They all have different receptor systems and neurotransmitter systems, and you know, they're involved in different things. You know, it integrates things like memory, past experience, cognitive states, straight up, you know, like affective states. But it involves all of these things, and so you know, it's not like treating. It's, you know, as difficult to treat as Parkinson's disease is. It's even more difficult than that, because like at least with Parkinson's we know some very specific discrete components of the condition. When it comes to depression, there's so many systems involved. That said, the only thing, depression, just like every other aspect of consciousness, obeys the laws of physics, right? It's not like there's a magical source of depression that is beyond our grasp. So the only thing that's preventing us from curing it is just a lack of knowledge. And one thing that humans are good at is amassing knowledge. So, you know, it's frustrating. Believe me, I empathize. It's part of why I went into my PhD, but it's just going to take time and increased investments. Right? The more sophisticated we get in science, the more expensive it is to continue getting sophisticated in science, to continue learning new things. It's like a, you know, not quite exponential, but you know, it just, things get more and more difficult as we go, despite the fact that we're learning more along the way, right? So we just have to continue investing, and, you know, be serious about wanting to understand consciousness, because once we do that, or at least wanting to understand the granular biology of mood, of affect, once we understand that, then, like, I could give you just one example of like one possible treatment for depression that arises from my own work. So I studied a circuit in the brain that is involved in the withdrawal syndrome that people experience when they stop chronically using alcohol, opioids, nicotine, and probably also stimulants, but we have less data for that. And it's this very weird circuit right in the middle of the brain, but what's unique about it is that it has these unique types of receptors that aren't basically anywhere else in the brain, meaning that if we're correct that this structure is meaningfully involved in depression, or anxiety is really what I was studying, but, you know, similar principle to other circuits, then we could design drugs that specifically target those receptors and therefore specifically target that circuit. And we could make drugs that would activate those receptors or inhibit those receptors. And so that same principle could be applied to depression, to post-traumatic stress disorder, to OCD, but what we need is a more completed neuroscience, and we're just not there yet. All right, I should call it a day. I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. I talked about the biology of politics, basically. The neurobiology of politics, the genetics of politics, a little bit, just a little bit. It's on YouTube, youtube.com/anthropoid. And you can check that out. It's right in the beginning. And if you're interested in those kinds of things, I talk about not just politics. Believe me, I rarely ever talk about politics. And I'm not trying to argue for any specific, not advocating for any particular political perspective. But you can check it out. Pretty weird stuff that we discuss. But, you know, I talked about dreams, I talked about drugs, I talked about Neuralink, you know, whole brain computer interfaces. So youtube.com/anthropoid. And, you know, subscribe if you're interested. Tickle that, prod and tickle that little subscription button. And I have a podcast called Wired to be Weird, where we go in much greater depth on these topics. Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. Yeah, if you have any, like, you know, ideas for things to cover, reach out on Twitter @_anthropoid. Otherwise, have a great week, everybody. Go out and vote on Tuesday, right? If you haven't already voted, go out and vote if you're in the United States. Wear a face covering, cover your mouth, cover your nose. Bring some hand sanitizer. I can tell you that's what I'm doing. Bringing, wearing a mask, obviously, which has actually a MERV 16 filter in it. It's very discreet. And I bring, you know, a little thing of hand sanitizer and, participate, on Tuesday. Beyond that, have a great week. And I will see you, hopefully, in the same place, same time, right here, be there. And we'll be talking about something else. And we'll have learned a lot about what the future of this country is going to look like, right? Because the election will have happened. So check it out. All right, I'll see you there. Have a great week. All right, YouTube, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I appreciate it. Oh, some birds just flew by. Yeah, so, you know, if you have any ideas for topics, let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, or, you know, if you think that I might at some point cover something that you actually do find interesting, you can hit subscribe, and I would appreciate it. Other than that, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next week. See you guys.